In our Introduction to Apologetics series, we've been reviewing the basic case that can be made for the historical reliability of the New Testament. We've been organizing this review around three important claims, and in the past two episodes in this series, we've looked at some reasons to think that the first two of these claims are true, those being that the New Testament writers were able to write a reliable account, and that the New Testament writers intended to write a reliable account. In this episode, we'll briefly survey some reasons to think that the last claim is also true. That is, the claim that the New Testament writers actually did write a reliable account. Now, the evidence that the New Testament writers actually did provide us with a historically reliable account can be broken down into three general categories. First, there's what sometimes goes by the name signs of credibility. It's also sometimes called marks of authenticity. And here we'll see that much of what the New Testament reports about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus meets the criteria that historians use when evaluating the historical reliability of a source. Then we'll consider confirmation of the New Testament from non-canonical sources. And here we'll look at ancient sources, Christian and non-Christian, that corroborate some of the central claims of the New Testament. And finally, we'll have a brief look at how archaeology has added support to the general historical reliability of the New Testament. And here we'll consider ways in which archaeological discoveries have contributed to the credibility of some New Testament reports. So let's start with the signs of credibility. When assessing a reported event, historians deploy certain historical criteria that guide them in estimating the probability of the event's actual occurrence. These criteria are used by historians. They're based on common sense intuitions. In fact, these intuitions on what makes a source reliable are also used by detectives and lawyers, and really by anyone trying to get at the truth of a report concerning a past event. There are a couple of things to keep in mind as we look at the historical criteria. First, it's important to understand that the various historical criteria only add to the probability of an event having occurred. They never detract from that probability. In other words, just because a reported event doesn't meet the criteria, it does not necessarily mean that what is being reported probably did not, in fact, occur. These historical criteria should be seen as a part of a broader historical argument. There are, of course, other considerations for historicity that must also be taken into account. These criteria also have a cumulative effect. In other words, the more criteria that are met, the more likely historians will consider the event reported to have actually occurred. Okay, so let's look at some of the criteria used when evaluating the historicity of some reported event in the New Testament. The first criteria is that of being reported early. Events reported earlier to the occurrence of the event in time are generally considered to be more reliable and are preferred to those reported later from the event in time. Now, we've already seen that many of the sources in the New Testament are early, having been written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. And we saw that some of the sources are extremely early, historically speaking, having been first reported within months after the events described. A second criterion is that of multiple independent attestation. Events reported by multiple independent sources are generally considered to be more reliable than events reported by a single source. Now, this is probably the most popular criterion among historians. And here it's important to remember that the New Testament, properly understood, is not one document, but a collection of documents from different authors. These authors used a variety of sources in their reporting. Though some of the sources in the New Testament are dependent on a single source, there is some material, for example, in the Synoptic Gospels that probably borrow from the same source. Many of the sources within the New Testament are independent from each other. Then we have the criterion of multiple forms. Events reported in different forms are more likely to be earlier and are considered to be more reliable. Now, within the New Testament, we often find a single event reported in different forms, such as narrative, parable, creed, sermon summary, and so forth. And then there is the criterion of embarrassing testimony. Events reported that include information understood to be embarrassing admissions are considered more reliable. Now, the New Testament is loaded with information that would have been considered embarrassing to the people reporting. There is, for example, the scandal of Jesus' death by crucifixion. There's Peter's denial of Christ. There's the frequent ignorance, unbelief, and stubbornness of the disciples. There's the discovery of the empty tomb by women, and so on. The next criterion is that of enemy or disinterested attestation. Events reported that come from rivals, that concede some information favorable to their opponents, are considered more reliable. Rivals and enemy sources are unlikely to confirm the report from an opposing source unless they agree that the report is accurate. And disinterested sources have no vested interest in the outcome of an event, and so also increase reliability. Two powerful examples of enemy attestation in the New Testament are Paul and James, the half-brother of Jesus. Prior to his own conversion, Paul was an enemy and persecutor of the Jesus movement, and James was a skeptic. Both of these men began as unbelievers who were only later converted because of their own encounter with the risen Jesus. And finally, the last criterion we'll look at here is consistency or coherence. Events that are reported that do not cohere with what we know about the historical context in which they're situated are considered to be less reliable. This is one of the few criteria with a negative function. If not met, the report is seen to be less reliable. And as we saw last time, the New Testament is full of fine-grained details related to rulers, place names, regions, geography, customs, and cultures that were highly specific to the time and place of Jesus' life in first century Palestine. The New Testament fits nicely into the historical context of the Roman and Judean world in the first century AD. These, then, are some of the most important historical criteria used by historians to help ascertain the probability of a reported event and to help evaluate the quality of a historical source. And as we've seen, the New Testament generally, as a collection of sources, exhibits these criteria. One can argue that the New Testament, considered broadly as a source, exhibits the signs of credibility or the marks of authenticity. But importantly, the criteria can also be used to assess the reliability of certain specific reports in the New Testament in isolation. And this is especially useful when assessing the reliability of the information specific to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. When we look at the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus in another episode, we'll apply these historical criteria to certain central facts surrounding this central event to see how they measure up. But for now, and just to see how this works, let's use these criteria to evaluate the reliability of the New Testament claim that Jesus performed miracles, that Jesus was a miracle worker. The fact that Jesus performed miracles meets the first criterion of being reported early. This report about Jesus is found in all four of the Gospels, which, as we've seen, were written during the time when the eyewitnesses were still alive. And it's reported in the probably even earlier sermon summaries in the book of Acts. It also meets the criterion of having multiple independent attestation. The fact that Jesus was a miracle worker is not only reported throughout the New Testament text, the Gospels, Acts, epistles. It's also attested to in some early non-canonical sources. And we'll look at an example of one of these when we consider some non-canonical sources momentarily. It meets the criterion of enemy attestation. Sometimes the miracles of Jesus are interpreted in an uncharitable and hostile way. For example, the Pharisees did not challenge that Jesus performed miracles, but instead attributed Jesus' power to demons. And later, rabbinic tradition is consistent with this claim, admitting that Jesus did in fact perform wonders, but then ascribing them to sorcery. And finally, the fact that Jesus was a miracle worker meets the criterion of embarrassing testimony. Both Mark and Matthew report that Jesus performed fewer miracles than usual at certain points in his ministry because of the unbelief that was present in the people. Now, this seems to call Jesus' power into question. It's not something that we should expect someone to make up. So according to the historical criteria, the New Testament report that Jesus was a miracle worker should be considered as historically reliable. In addition to exhibiting the signs of credibility, much of what the New Testament reports has been corroborated by non-canonical sources, or historical sources from outside of the New Testament. We actually have a surprising number of surviving writings from ancient sources close to the New Testament. That is, sources from the 1st century and early 2nd century, that contain information which overlaps with what is given in the New Testament, adding credibility to the New Testament accounts. All right, let's look at non-Christian sources first. When considering early non-Christian sources, it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. First, we need to temper our expectations about secular sources of information about Jesus. We should expect existing non-Christian references to Jesus within the 1st century to be extremely rare. In fact, it's quite remarkable that we have any, and there's several reasons for this. First, it has to be remembered that the vast majority of documents or books written within the 1st century have not survived, and what has survived from this period is mostly fragmentary. In addition, the impact of Jesus was not felt by the Roman Empire for decades after his death. There is simply no way that ancient historians and writers could have foreseen the influence that Jesus was to have on the world. Then remember that Jesus lived in a remote and fairly insignificant part of the Roman Empire. Judea was of little importance to Rome, and unless in rebellion, it garnered little attention from the empire. And finally, a single religious leader from a minority religious group who gained only a very small following and was executed by Roman authorities would not have been an exceptional or noteworthy event. I also think that we need to be careful not to overemphasize the importance of non-Christian sources, as if they are somehow free from bias or more trustworthy than Christian sources are. In actual fact, the New Testament writings themselves are far better sources, historically speaking, than non-Christian sources. Most of the New Testament sources predate non-Christian sources by decades, and they were written by people who were much closer to the events reported. All right, well, with these things in mind, there are a number of ancient non-Christian sources that mention Jesus. And here we'll just focus our attention on 3 of the most notable ones. All right, let's start with Josephus. Josephus lived approximately 37 to 97 AD, and he's considered one of the most important sources for Jesus because he was a younger contemporary of the apostles, and he was from Judea. Although he began as a prominent Jewish rebel to Rome, he later switched sides to become a Roman historian and an advocate of Rome after the Jewish rebellion of which he took part failed. In one of his historical writings, The Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus mentions both Jesus and the half-brother of Jesus, James. Now, although scholars generally agree that Josephus' account of Jesus in the Antiquities was likely tampered with by later Christian scribes to some minimal extent, most also believe that a reasonable reconstruction of the passage can be made, removing the possible Christian interpolation or the Christian gloss that was added later. This reconstructed neutral text that most scholars accept as authentic reads like this, quote, "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out." End quote. In this redacted text, Josephus confirms several important facts that are recorded in the New Testament. That Jesus was wise and amazed the people, that he had many followers, that he was condemned by Jewish leaders and crucified under Pontius Pilate, that his followers, called Christians, did not abandon Jesus after he was crucified, but continued to love and follow him, and were still around in Josephus' time. Later, in the same work, Josephus also mentions James, the brother of Jesus. He writes, quote, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrim of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." End quote. Notice that Jesus receives only a passing comment in this passage because Josephus had already talked about Jesus in an earlier one, as we have seen. And here Josephus further corroborates the New Testament report that Jesus had a brother named James, and that Jesus was called the Christ, or Messiah. Then there's Cornelius Tacitus, who lived somewhere between AD 55 and AD 120. Tacitus was a historian and a member of the Roman aristocracy. In his book, The Annals, he writes of the great fire that broke out in Rome in AD 64, and about the rumors that the Emperor Nero himself had started it. He tells us that in the attempt to exonerate himself, Nero shifted the blame for the fire to the Christians who were living in Rome at the time. Tacitus writes, quote, "Consequently, and to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome." End quote. Here Tacitus corroborates important information provided in the New Testament, that Christians were named after their founder, Christ or Christus, that Jesus was executed by crucifixion, the extreme penalty, at the hands of Pontius Pilate, that the movement Jesus founded stopped briefly after the crucifixion, but then broke out again in Judea, and that Christianity had spread to Rome. Then there's Pliny the Younger. He lived circa AD 61 to 113. Pliny was deeply connected and variously employed in Roman government, and he had personal correspondence with the Roman Emperor Trajan. Pliny makes some remarks about Christians in a letter he sent to Trajan in AD 112. The letter was sent for the purpose of getting clarity from the emperor on procedural questions related to the interrogation and persecution of the Christians in his domain. This letter, as well as the subsequent response from the Emperor Trajan, are fascinating because they provide a window into how Rome viewed the early Christians and how Rome attempted to root them out of society through persecution. In his personal correspondence to Trajan, Pliny describes what he learned of Christian practice at the time from his interrogations of Christians. Writing to Trajan, he says, quote, "They, Christians, had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately among themselves in honor of Christ, as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust, and not to deny a deposit when called upon to restore it. And after this ceremony, it had been their custom to disperse and reassemble later to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind." End quote. Pliny's letter is important because it represents the first non-Christian description of early Christian worship that we have. Moreover, it corroborates what the New Testament reports about the Christian practice of gathering together on a certain day each week, the Christian worship of Christ as God, and Christian teaching regarding the abstinence of sinful behavior. So if we combine the information corroborated by just these three early non-Christian sources, we get a surprising amount of corroboration of New Testament information. That Jesus was wise and amazed the people, that Jesus had many followers, that Jesus was called the Christ or Messiah, that Jesus was condemned by Jewish leaders and crucified under Pontius Pilate, that Jesus' followers were called Christians, that the Jesus movement briefly stopped after the crucifixion, but then broke out again in Judea, that Jesus had a brother named James, that Christianity spread to Rome, that Christians gathered together on a certain day each week, that Christians worshiped Christ as God, and that Christians restrained themselves from sinful behavior. There are also early Christian sources outside the New Testament that independently corroborate and confirm information presented in the New Testament. Again, we'll limit our consideration to just three of the earliest and most important sources. First, there's Clement of Rome, who lived circa AD 65 to 95. Clement was the bishop of the Christian church in Rome and a direct link to some of the apostles. In his writings, he provided independent witness and confirmation of the life, deeds, and teaching of Jesus, and he corroborates other New Testament information, such as the factionalism that existed within the Corinthian church, the suffering and persecutions of Paul, and the existence and authority of Paul's epistles to the Corinthians. Importantly, Clement also confirms that both Peter and Paul were martyred for their witness to Christ. Although this is not direct confirmation of the New Testament reliability, since the New Testament doesn't mention the martyrdom of Peter or Paul, it does provide indirect support for the reliability of the New Testament account. The fact that Paul and Peter were willing to die for their witness to the risen Jesus provides good reason to believe that they were telling the truth. Nobody willingly dies for what he knows to be a lie. Liars make poor martyrs. Clement's account of the apostles' willingness to suffer and die for Christ is moving. He writes, quote, "Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors. And when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance after being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee, and stoned. After preaching both in the East and West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the West, and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus was he removed from the world, and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience." End quote. Then there's Ignatius of Antioch, who lived somewhere between 35 and 110 AD. Ignatius was bishop of the church in Antioch, who was martyred for Christ around AD 110. While in chains on the journey to Rome for his execution, Ignatius wrote at least 7 letters to a variety of churches. In his letters, he often overlaps and corroborates various New Testament reports and information, including the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the existence of a unified gospel message, and the special divine authority of Peter and Paul. And like Clement, Ignatius also represents a direct link to some of the apostles, and he also confirms the suffering and martyrdom of Peter and some other of the disciples. Polycarp of Smyrna, who lived circa AD 69 to 155, was the bishop of the church of Smyrna, and with Clement and Ignatius, provides another direct link to the apostles. Irenaeus of Lyons tells us that Polycarp was instructed by the apostles and appointed by the apostles bishop of the church of Smyrna, and that he knew the apostle John personally. Although Polycarp wrote multiple letters, the only one that survived is the one written to the church of Philippi. In this letter, Polycarp corroborates critical information given in the New Testament, including the death and resurrection of Christ, the authority and divine inspiration of the apostle Paul, and the persecution of Paul and other apostles. Polycarp is another source for the martyrdom of Paul. So these then are just 3 examples of early Christian writers who corroborate critical information provided by the New Testament. And again, this is just a sampling. There are many more Christian sources that we could have mentioned here who also confirm various components of the New Testament. But let's now turn to archaeology. Archaeological discoveries can also add to the credibility of New Testament reports. Now, it's important to understand that archaeology rarely provides direct and explicit confirmation of historical events from the ancient past. The fact is that most of the ancient world has been lost to us. So the lack of archaeological evidence does not by itself imply that the report of an event is unhistorical or unreliable. Arguments from archaeological silence are almost always fallacious. The vast majority of events that occur every day leave no physical remains. We have to be careful then not to overstate the lack of archaeological evidence. Lack of archaeological evidence for some reported event, in most cases, does not disprove anything. But we also have to be careful not to overstate the archaeological evidence in the other direction. Just as the lack of archaeological evidence does not necessarily disprove the occurrence of a reported event, positive archaeological evidence does not necessarily prove the occurrence of a reported event. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, archaeology can be used to bolster the credibility of what is reported from a broad perspective. It does this by corroborating the consistency of the general setting and details presented by the New Testament. It can be used, for example, to confirm the existence of certain places, geographies, customs, or persons reported in the New Testament. To see how archaeology can add credibility to the broad perspective of the New Testament account, let's consider a handful of discoveries. All right, let's start with Caiaphas's ossuary. In 1990, an ossuary, or bone box, was discovered containing the bones of a 60-year-old male with the inscription, Josephus, son of Caiaphas, carved into it. Now, because of the ornate design and quality of the box, which indicate the elite status of the man, and in light of the description on the box, it's widely believed that these bones belong to the Caiaphas mentioned in the New Testament, who was the high priest at the trial of Jesus. Remarkably, in all likelihood, we have the very bones of the man that the New Testament tells us sentenced Jesus to death. An incredible discovery. Another remarkable discovery came in 1968, when the bones of a crucifixion victim named Jehohanan was discovered. The bones were dated to the late 20s AD, which would have been during the lifetime of Jesus. Remarkably, one of the heels of the skeleton still contains the nail that was pounded through it and used to fasten the legs to the cross. Although Jehohanan is not mentioned in the New Testament, the discovery of his bones helped corroborate certain facts related to Jesus' crucifixion, such as the fact that nails were commonly used to secure victims to the cross at that time. Importantly, the discovery also confirms that crucifixion victims could receive a proper burial, and this refuted the claim made by some critical scholars who, prior to this discovery, argued that because Jesus died by crucifixion, his body would not have been buried, but rather dumped into a pit or mass grave. Some other notable discoveries include coins that confirm the existence of Pontius Pilate, the inscription of a temple warning for Gentiles, confirming the details surrounding Paul's arrest in Acts 21:27-36, the Pool of Bethesda with its 5 porticos near the Sheep Gate in Jerusalem, confirming John's report in John 5:2, and the Delphi inscription confirming the rule and date of Gallio as proconsul of Corinth, confirming the narrative in Acts 18:11-17. Archaeological discoveries like these that confirm the broad outlines of New Testament accounts could be multiplied. In his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, historian and classical scholar Colin Hemmer isolated the last 16 chapters in Acts for a detailed analysis of Luke's historical accuracy. Incredibly, Hemmer was able to identify 84 facts from this section of Acts alone that have been confirmed and corroborated by archaeological and historical research. Here are the first 14 of these confirmed facts from just 3 chapters of Acts as a sample. The natural crossing between correctly named ports, the proper port Perga along the direct destination of a ship crossing from Cyprus, the proper location of Lycaonia, the unusual but correct declension of the name Lystra, the correct language spoken in Lystra, Lycaonian, the 2 gods known to be associated with Lystra, Zeus and Hermes, the proper port Attilia, which returning travelers would use, the correct order of approach to Derbe, and then Lystra from the Sicilian gates. The proper form of the name Troas, the place of a conspicuous sailor's landmark, Samothrace, the proper description of Philippi as a Roman colony, the right location for the river Gangites near Philippi, the proper association of Thyatira as a center of dyeing, and the correct designations for magistrates of the colony. As the Roman historian A.N. Sherwin-White remarks, quote, "For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd," end quote. Archaeologist William Ramsey was initially skeptical about the historicity of the Book of Acts, but as he himself recounts, his mind was changed as he gradually encountered the historical evidence. He writes, quote, "I began with a mind unfavorable to Acts. It did not lie then in my line of life to investigate the subject minutely, but more recently I found myself often brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth," end quote. It must be remembered that the author of the Book of Acts, Luke, also wrote the Gospel of Luke. If Luke has proved to be a careful chronicler and historian in Acts, there's every reason to believe that he would approach his gospel with the same level of care and accuracy. And this is, in fact, precisely what we do find in Luke. Multiple details of the Gospel of Luke have also been confirmed and verified through historical and archaeological research. For example, in just the first 3 chapters of his Gospel, Luke names 11 officials and leaders that have been historically verified today by both non-Christian writers and archaeology. In fact, there are no less than 30 individuals reported in the New Testament whose actual existence has been historically verified by means of both non-Christian references and archaeological discovery. So much more could be said on this subject, but what has been said is, I think, sufficient to conclude that there are very good reasons to believe that the New Testament writers actually did provide us with a reliable account. In conclusion, then, when it comes to the question of the historical reliability of the New Testament, I think that after 3 episodes, we are now in a position to affirm all 3 of the following statements with a high degree of confidence: that the New Testament writers were able to write a reliable account, that the New Testament writers intended to write a reliable account, and that the New Testament writers actually did write a reliable account.